The sun was beginning to set over the Texas countryside, casting golden light across the open fields. The air was warm but carried the first hints of an autumn chill, rustling through the trees that line the narrow, winding road. Frank Matthews, a man who had once stood tall in uniform, now moved at a slower pace, his footsteps heavy as he made his way up the cracked sidewalk of Pine Valley Animal Rescue. He had never thought he'd find himself here. Frank had spent over 20 years in the Army, his life dictated by routine, discipline, and a sense of duty that had once given him purpose. But now, in the quiet of civilian life, purpose felt like a distant memory. The friends he had fought beside were scattered across the country, some lost to time, others to war in ways that didn't involve bullets. His family, what little remained, lived states away. His days blurred together, early mornings spent staring at his coffee, afternoons filled with the sound of nothing. It had been his sister, Margaret, who had suggested the shelter. "You need something, Frank," she had said over the phone, her voice filled with the kind of concern only an older sibling could carry. "You can't keep sitting in that house, staring at the past. Maybe a dog would help. You always had a way with them." Frank had dismissed the idea at first. A dog was a commitment. A responsibility. Something that required care and attention, and if he was honest, he wasn't sure he had any of that left in him. But after another week of silence pressing down on him like an old wound, he had finally gotten in his truck and driven to Pine Valley. Now, standing outside the shelter's front door, he felt foolish. The building was small, with a faded sign and a wooden bench out front. The windows were fogged with age, and the paint on the doorframe had started to peel. Inside, he could hear the distant barking of dogs, some high-pitched and eager, others low and tired. The smell of antiseptic and wet fur met him the moment he stepped inside, mingling with the faint scent of coffee brewing in the back room. A young man in his early 20s, wearing a shelter volunteer shirt, looked up from the front desk. "Afternoon, sir. Looking to adopt?" Frank hesitated. The truth was, he didn't know what he was looking for. "Just seeing what you got," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. The volunteer nodded, not pressing the issue. He gestured toward the kennels in the back. "Take your time. We've got all kinds. Some have been here a while, looking for the right person." Frank gave a curt nod and started walking down the rows of cages. The dogs reacted in different ways. Some jumped against the metal bars, eager for attention. Others watched him with cautious eyes, tails wagging hesitantly. But none of them felt right. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he'd know it when he found it. And then, at the very end of the row, in the last kennel tucked away from the others, he stopped cold. Lying in the farthest corner of the cage was a large, black Antan German Shepherd, his body still, his eyes half-lidded in exhaustion. His fur was dull, his frame thinner than it should have been, but there was something in the way he carried himself that made Frank's chest tighten. He didn't need to read the name on the kennel card. He already knew. It was Shadow. The same dog who had been by his side in war. The same dog who had saved his life more times than he could count. The same dog who, once upon a time, had looked at him like he was the only thing in the world that mattered. But Shadow didn't move. No recognition. No light in his eyes. Frank swallowed hard, his heart beating too loudly in his ears. For the first time in a long time, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt fear. Not of the dog in the cage. Not of the years that had passed. But of the possibility that Shadow no longer remembered him at all. Frank stood frozen, gripping the metal bars of the kennel as if they were the only thing keeping him upright. His breath hitched in his chest as he stared at Shadow, the dog who had once been his partner, his protector, his closest friend in a world of chaos and war. But Shadow didn't react. There was no spark of recognition, no twitch of the ears, no tail wag. The German Shepherd's dark eyes flicked toward him for only a second before turning away, as if Frank were just another stranger passing by. "Sir?" The voice behind him startled Frank out of his trance. He turned to see a shelter worker, a woman in her early 40s with kind but tired eyes, standing nearby. Her name tag read Karen. "You know him?" she asked, noting the way Frank was gripping the kennel door. Frank exhaled slowly before answering. "Yeah. I know him." His voice was rough, his throat dry. Karen's expression softened, but she didn't seem surprised. She glanced at Shadow, then back at Frank, her voice dropping to a quieter tone. "He came in about a month ago. Was transferred from a shelter a few states over. Poor guy's been through a lot." Frank didn't need to be told that. He could see it. The once powerful war dog, the soldier in his own right, now looked thin and worn down. His ears drooped slightly, his body held none of the confident stance it once had. He was broken in ways Frank understood all too well. "What happened to him?" Frank asked, his voice tighter than he intended. Karen sighed. "We don't know much. He was surrendered by someone who said they couldn't handle him. He wouldn't eat for days when he first got here. Has a hard time trusting people. We think he's been moved around a lot." She paused. "PTSD, most likely." The words hit Frank like a punch to the gut. PTSD. It was a term people used lightly these days, but Frank knew the weight it carried. He had lived with it for years, the restless nights, the flinching at loud noises, the feeling that danger lurked around every corner. And now, Shadow was suffering from it too. "I want to take him." The words were out before he even thought about them. Karen hesitated. "He's not the easiest dog. He doesn't respond to people the way most dogs do. We've tried working with him, but..." She looked back at Shadow, who remained curled in the corner of his kennel, unmoving. "He just doesn't seem to care anymore." Frank's jaw tightened. He knew that feeling, too. "I'm not leaving him here," he said, his voice low but firm. Karen studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to argue. But something in Frank's face must have convinced her. She nodded slowly. "Let's take him outside. See how he does with you." Frank swallowed, a nervous energy creeping into his chest. He followed Karen as she retrieved a leash and carefully opened the kennel door. Shadow barely reacted, only lifting his head slightly before sighing and standing up. He moved sluggishly, as if even existing was exhausting. Karen handed Frank the leash. He took it carefully, waiting for a reaction. Nothing. They led Shadow out into the small fenced yard behind the shelter. The other dogs inside barked and whined as they passed, but Shadow ignored them, his head low, his tail limp. Once outside, Frank crouched down, leveling himself with the dog he had once trusted with his life. "Hey, partner." His voice was softer now, full of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Shadow flicked his ears but didn't meet his gaze. Frank's chest ached. He tried again. "It's me. It's Frank." Still nothing. Frank hesitated, then reached out, slow and careful, the way he would with a spooked soldier. Shadow flinched. That nearly broke him. Shadow had never flinched before. Not in the middle of firefights, not in explosions, not in the worst places they had been together. And yet, here he was, shying away from the only person who had ever truly been his friend. Frank pulled his hand back, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Okay, boy. I get it." He forced his voice to stay steady. "We'll take it slow." Karen watched silently, giving Frank space. After a few minutes, she finally spoke. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Frank didn't hesitate. "Yeah," he said, standing up. "I'm sure." There was no question in his mind. He had lost too much already. He wasn't about to lose Shadow too. The drive home was silent. Frank kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting Shadow to shift, to look at him, to show some sign, any sign, that he remembered. But the German Shepherd just lay in the back seat, staring blankly out the window. No whining. No curiosity. No recognition. Frank tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He had prepared himself for a difficult road ahead, but he hadn't expected this, a complete absence of connection. He remembered a time when Shadow would have been alert, watching every movement on the road, ears twitching at every unfamiliar sound. He used to sit upright, scanning for threats, his instincts always razor-sharp. But this version of Shadow? This was a ghost of the dog he once knew. As they pulled up to Frank's house, he cut the engine and turned in his seat. "We're home, boy." Shadow didn't move. Frank sighed and got out, walking around to open the passenger door. He expected hesitation, maybe even resistance, but Shadow climbed out mechanically, his paws barely making a sound against the gravel driveway. The house was modest, sitting on a few acres of land just outside of town. It was quiet out here, the kind of quiet Frank had once craved after leaving the military. But now, the silence felt too heavy. He led Shadow inside, keeping his movements slow and easy, not wanting to overwhelm him. "Go on, take a look around," Frank said, gesturing toward the open space of the living room. But Shadow didn't explore. Instead, he walked to the nearest wall, sat down, and stared at nothing. Frank exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. He had expected fear, anxiety, maybe even defiance. But not this, a dog so lost he didn't seem to exist at all. He had seen soldiers come home like this. Hell, he had been one of them. Frank moved to the kitchen, pulling out a bowl and filling it with fresh water. He set it near Shadow, but the dog didn't react. Next, he grabbed a bag of food, pouring some into a dish. "You gotta eat, buddy," he murmured. Still nothing. Frank sat on the couch, watching Shadow from a distance. He didn't approach. He didn't force anything. Because he knew what it was like to be forced into healing before you were ready. Night fell, and Frank made his way to his bedroom, leaving the door open just enough for Shadow to see inside. He lay in bed, listening. Minutes passed. Then an hour. And just as his eyes started to drift shut, he heard it, the soft sound of paws against the hardwood floor. Shadow hadn't followed him into the room. But he had moved closer. And for tonight, that was enough. Frank woke at dawn, the light creeping through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. He turned his head toward the doorway, half expecting to see Shadow curled up there, waiting. But the space was empty. He sighed and pushed himself up, his joints protesting the movement. Years of service had left their mark, not just on his body, but on his soul. He had seen too much, lost too much. And now, he was staring at the possibility of losing one more piece of his past. Padding down the hallway, he found Shadow exactly where he had left him the night before, sitting in the same spot by the wall, staring at nothing. The house felt different now. It had always been quiet, but this was a heavier silence, one that carried weight, pressing down on both of them. Frank set to work making coffee, the rich aroma filling the air. He poured himself a cup, then hesitated. After a moment, he grabbed another bowl and set it down in front of Shadow, dropping in a few pieces of bacon. Shadow didn't move. Frank sat across from him, sipping his coffee, watching, waiting. "You used to love bacon," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "I used to have to fight you off my breakfast plate back in Kandahar." Shadow's ears twitched. It was a small movement, but it was something. Frank leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't know what they did to you, boy. I don't know how they let you get like this." He sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "But I know what it feels like. I know what it's like to come home and not know where you belong anymore." Silence. Frank let out a bitter chuckle. "Hell, maybe that's why Margaret sent me to that damn shelter. Maybe she figured if I couldn't fix myself, I'd at least try to fix you." Shadow blinked, but still didn't move. By afternoon, Frank decided to test something. He walked over to a worn-out dog bed he had set up in the corner, the same spot where Shadow used to sleep in their old barracks. "Come on, buddy. Let's get you comfortable." He patted the bed softly. Shadow stood, and for a brief second, Frank thought he might actually listen. But instead, the German Shepherd walked past him and lay down by the door. Still waiting for someone else. still not recognizing the home that was his. Frank swallowed hard, pushing down the frustration creeping up his spine. This wasn't going to be easy. But neither of them had ever had easy lives. And he wasn't giving up now. The days slipped by in slow, quiet rhythms. Frank had never been one for unnecessary noise, but the silence between him and Shadow was something else entirely. It was absence, the kind that settled into the bones, the kind that spoke louder than words. Still, Frank had learned patience in the army. He knew better than to force something before its time. So, he waited. Each morning, he placed fresh food and water in Shadow's bowls. The dog never ate when Frank was watching, but by the time evening rolled around, the dishes would be empty. It wasn't much, but it meant Shadow still had a will to survive. That was something. Frank tried different things to stir old memories. One day, he left his military duffel bag open near Shadow's corner. It still smelled of sand, sweat, and years spent in places neither of them wanted to remember. Shadow sniffed the bag once. Then he turned away. Another time, Frank sat on the back porch, a beer in one hand, an old training whistle in the other. He brought it to his lips and let out 2 short bursts, the same signal he had used countless times on patrol. Shadow's ears twitched. His head lifted, just for a moment. Then he lowered it again, retreating back into whatever place his mind had taken him. Frank exhaled slowly, setting the whistle down beside him. "You remember, don't you?" he murmured. But remembering wasn't the problem. Trusting was. That night, something shifted. Frank had just turned off the lights when he heard it, the soft, steady sound of paws against the wooden floor. He held his breath, keeping his body still. Waiting. A moment later, Shadow appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. He didn't enter, didn't try to get close. But he didn't go back to his corner, either. Instead, he lay down right outside the door. Frank swallowed the lump in his throat. It wasn't much. But it was the first step. The next morning, he pretended not to notice the change, letting Shadow set the pace. He went about his routine as usual, feeding the dog, drinking his coffee, talking to him without expecting a response. But for the first time since bringing him home, Shadow's eyes followed him across the room. He still didn't move when Frank spoke. But he was watching. And for Frank, that was enough to keep trying. The change was small, so small that someone else might not have noticed. But Frank did. Shadow was watching him now, following his movements, his eyes lingering a little longer when Frank spoke. He still kept his distance, still didn't react to affection, but there was a shift, a crack in the wall that had been built between them. Frank knew better than to rush it. Instead, he kept things simple. Routine. Structure. Familiarity. Every morning, he'd pour coffee for himself, then set down a small treat near Shadow's bowl. He never forced the dog to take it, but by nightfall, it was always gone. Every afternoon, he'd sit outside on the porch, beer in hand, talking, not expecting answers, just letting his voice fill the silence. And every night, he'd leave the bedroom door cracked open. It had started with Shadow lying outside the doorway. Then, a few nights later, Frank had woken up to find him inside the room, curled up near the far wall. It wasn't much. But it was trust. Still, something was missing. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Frank stood in his garage, rummaging through an old storage trunk he hadn't opened in years. Dust coated his fingers as he pulled out a worn military vest, the same one he had worn on missions with Shadow. It smelled like old sweat, faded memories, and the kind of bond that didn't break, even after war. Frank carried it outside, where Shadow was lying in the yard, staring at nothing. Slowly, carefully, Frank set the vest down a few feet away. Then he stepped back, sitting down on the porch steps. For a long time, Shadow didn't move. Then, a flicker of something. His ears perked. His nose twitched. He lifted his head, sniffing the air, sensing something familiar buried beneath the weight of lost time. Frank held his breath. Shadow stood. Not all the way, not with the confidence he once had, but he moved toward the vest. He lowered his head, sniffing the fabric. His breath hitched. Frank saw it then, the recognition, the memory breaking through. Shadow whimpered. A soft, broken sound. The kind of sound that carried years of ghosts and battles fought in silence. Frank swallowed against the tightness in his throat. "Yeah, buddy," he said softly. "You remember." Shadow didn't look at him, not yet. But he didn't move away, either. And for Frank, that was the biggest step yet. The next morning, Frank stood by the front door, leash in hand. He hadn't tried taking Shadow out since bringing him home. Too soon, too much. But after what happened with the vest, Frank felt it was time. "Come on, boy. Let's go for a walk." Shadow didn't move at first. Frank let the words settle, then stepped outside, leaving the door open. He didn't call for Shadow again. He just waited. For a long moment, Shadow remained still. His body was tense, like he was caught between instinct and uncertainty. Then, a small shift. His paws scraped against the floor. His ears twitched. And after what felt like forever, he stepped forward. Frank didn't turn around. He just kept walking. The leash dangled in his hand, but he didn't need it. Shadow followed, a few paces behind, his head low, his eyes darting around as if expecting the world outside to be something dangerous. Frank led them to a narrow dirt path behind the house, one that cut through the trees and opened up to an old clearing. The same clearing where he and Shadow had trained together years ago. As they walked, Frank spoke, his voice steady but soft. "This was our spot, remember? We used to run drills here. You were faster than me even back then." Shadow sniffed the air, his tail flicking once, almost uncertainly. Frank stopped at the center of the clearing, breathing in the scent of pine and damp earth. The last time he had stood here, it had been with a younger body, a sharper mind, and a dog who would have died for him without hesitation. He turned to Shadow. "Stay low, partner." It was a command he hadn't spoken in years. One Shadow had obeyed without question back then. The shepherd froze. His muscles stiffened, his ears snapped forward. For the first time, Frank saw it. Recognition. It wasn't full, not yet. But it was there, flickering behind Shadow's tired eyes. Frank's heart pounded. He crouched slightly, holding out his hand. "Come on, buddy. You know this." Shadow hesitated, and then, he moved. Not with confidence, not with ease, but he moved. And in that moment, Frank knew his best friend was still in there. The moment didn't last long, but it was enough. Shadow had moved toward him, not out of habit, not out of obedience, but out of recognition. Frank didn't push it. He knew better than to rush a soldier who was learning to feel safe again. Instead, he stood up, dusting off his jeans. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice steady but low, like it always had been in the field. Shadow didn't wag his tail. He didn't push against Frank's hand the way he used to. But he didn't step back, either. And that meant something. They walked back to the house together, closer than before, but still with space between them. The space didn't bother Frank. Healing wasn't about distance, it was about movement. That evening, as Frank sat on the porch, he tested something. He picked up an old tennis ball, rolling it between his fingers. It wasn't Shadow's favorite, but it was close. He turned it over once, twice, then gently tossed it into the yard. Not far. Not fast. Just enough. Shadow watched it roll. Frank held his breath. The German shepherd's ears twitched. His eyes locked on the ball. For a long time, he didn't move. Then, a flicker of instinct. Shadow took one step forward. Then another. And finally, he reached the ball. Sniffed it. Nudged it with his nose. Frank felt his chest tighten. "Go on, partner," he murmured. Shadow hesitated, but then, he picked it up. The sight of the dog standing there, ball in his mouth, was almost too much. Frank let out a slow breath, swallowing against the emotion creeping up his throat. This wasn't just play. This was memory. And memory meant hope. Shadow carried the ball for a moment before dropping it at his feet. Not bringing it back, not yet. But not ignoring it, either. Frank nodded, more to himself than to Shadow. "We'll get there," he said, his voice filled with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Belief. Shadow didn't move toward him. But for the first time, he looked up and met Frank's eyes. And Frank knew the past wasn't lost. It was just waiting to be found again. The night was still, the air thick with the weight of an approaching storm. Frank sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, lost in thought. The progress with Shadow had been slow but steady, and for the first time in years, he felt something like hope creeping back in. Then, the thunder rolled in. It wasn't loud at first, just a low grumble in the distance, but it was enough to make Frank's pulse jump. Enough to take him back. Back to nights spent in desert outposts, where distant artillery had been the sound of survival. Back to moments when the difference between life and death had been measured in seconds. His breathing hitched, his fingers tightening around the ceramic mug. He knew the feeling well. The weight of old ghosts. The kind that crept in when you least expected them. Then, he felt it. The warmth of something solid, steady, Shadow. The dog had moved beside him, close enough that Frank could feel the press of his fur against his leg. Shadow wasn't a touchy dog anymore. He had spent weeks keeping his distance, hiding in his own silence. But now, in the middle of a storm, he was here. Frank let out a shaky breath and looked down. Shadow wasn't trembling. Wasn't pacing or searching for a place to hide. He was watching Frank. And in that moment, it wasn't Shadow who needed comfort. Frank reached out slowly, laying a hand on the shepherd's head. Shadow didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into it. And for the first time in a long time, Frank felt something in him steady. The thunder rumbled again, louder this time. But it didn't matter. Because they weren't alone in it anymore. Frank swallowed hard and gave a small nod. "Good boy," he whispered. Shadow closed his eyes, exhaling softly, settling at his feet. And in that moment, Frank knew Shadow wasn't just coming back to him. He had never really left. The morning after the storm, the sky was clear, the air crisp with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Frank stepped onto the porch, his coffee steaming in the cool air, watching as the sun stretched across the fields. Behind him, he heard the familiar click of claws against the wooden floor. Shadow. The German shepherd stepped outside, shaking the last remnants of sleep from his body. But this time, he didn't stop at the doorway. This time, he walked straight to Frank's side. Frank glanced down, taking in the sight, the dog who had once been his shadow in war, now standing beside him again, just like before. A quiet moment passed between them. Then, Frank did something he hadn't done in years. He picked up the old whistle from his pocket and gave 2 sharp blows, the same command they had trained with long ago. For a second, nothing happened. Then, Shadow moved. Not hesitantly, not with uncertainty, but with purpose. With trust. He trotted a few paces away, then turned back, his eyes bright in a way Frank hadn't seen since the war. Frank let out a slow breath, nodding. "Good boy." And then, Shadow wagged his tail. It was small, almost hesitant, but it was there. The final crack in the wall between them. Frank crouched down, gripping the old tennis ball in his hand. "One last test, buddy," he murmured, tossing it a few feet away. Shadow's gaze followed it, and for the first time, he didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, grabbed the ball, and trotted back, dropping it right at Frank's feet. Frank exhaled, feeling something tighten in his chest, something old and familiar. The weight of years. Of war. Of loss. But now, there was something else. Healing. Shadow sat beside him, eyes bright, waiting. Waiting for the next command. waiting for what came next. Frank chuckled, ruffling the dog's fur. "Guess we're not done yet, huh?" And for the first time in a long time, Frank knew they had both finally come home.